Greetings and welcome back to 303. We turn now to Junior English, and in your hymnals we are on page 896, 897 and following. Our project now is to introduce you to the historical period that we often will refer to as the Harlem Renaissance. So let's turn there now and speak about the Harlem Renaissance. Now, first of all, let's just get some vocabulary out of the way. The word Renaissance often is defined as rebirth, new awakening, rediscovery. All of these terms matter in our conversation. Secondly, Harlem is, of course, one of the important boroughs of New York City. And by the 1920s, you will have a large number of artists who are living and practicing in this and around this area. And this becomes then a new hotbed for all kinds of artistic development. Let's read on page 896, Literary History, Langston Hughes in Harlem. Langston Hughes was a leading light of the Harlem Renaissance, an artistic movement in which the voices of African American artists rose to the forefront of American culture. We have several headings. Let's read each of them. The Harlem Renaissance. Harlem in the 1920s. For some, it conjures images of jazz sessions at hot spots like the Cotton Club, of seedy speakeasies like the Clam Bake and the Hot Feet. For others, it brings to mind the artistic genius of writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston and painters like Aaron Douglas. In the 1920s, the New York City neighborhood of Harlem was home to an unprecedented flowering of African American talent that left an astonishing cultural legacy. First heading, a celebration of African American life. Known as the Harlem Renaissance, this remarkable period marked the first time that African American artists were taken seriously by the culture at large. I would definitely write that down in your notes. This is the first time that finally African American artists are received seriously, taken seriously. Quote, Negro life is seizing its first chances for group expression and self-determination, end quote, wrote sociologist Alan Locke in 1926. Harlem became what Locke termed, quote, the center of a spiritual coming of age, end quote, as its artists celebrated their culture and race. The artists and writers of this Renaissance did not share a style. Langston Hughes's realistic poems of downtrodden but determined people bear little resemblance to Conte Cullen's elegant sonnets. Instead, these artists shared the urgent need to document the experiences of their people. I would write that down. The urgent need to document the experiences of their people. The next heading, the center of the world. In the early 1900s, hundreds of thousands of African Americans embarked on what has come to be called the Great Migration, moving from the rural South to the industrial cities of the North. As more and more African Americans settled in Harlem, it became a meeting ground for writers, musicians, and artists. The work they produced was unique. Before the Harlem Renaissance, many African American writers had tried to emulate whites. By contrast, the Harlem writers celebrated their racial identity. The goal was to create, as Hughes put it, quote, an expression of our individual dark-skinned selves, end quote. Next heading, an outpouring of expression. Top of page 897. From the 1920s through the mid-1930s, 16 African-American writers published more than 50 volumes of poetry and fiction, an astounding amount of work. Other African Americans made their marks in art, music, theater. Aaron Douglas incorporated African images into his paintings. Blues singer Betsy Smith performed to packed houses. Musicians like Jelly Roll Morton, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington laid the foundations of jazz, a form of music that scholars argue is the only truly American art form. The movement's most influential advocate may have been Langston Hughes, whose poems combined the rhythms of jazz and blues with stories of Harlem life. Other writers, such as Conte Cullen and Claude McKay, wrote in more classical forms. Novelist Zora Neale Hurston combined African folklore with realistic narratives. The final heading, a powerful legacy. The impact of the Harlem Renaissance has been a subject of debate Most scholars agree that it opened doors for the acceptance of art and writing by African Americans. However, some say that the Harlem Renaissance artists were too interested in seeking the approval of the white establishment. Even Langston Hughes admitted that few African Americans had read his work. Still, the Harlem Renaissance gave Americans a language with which to begin a discussion of racism. It also broke ground for mid-century African American writers such as Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, and James Baldwin. Today, Nobel Prize winner Toni Morrison, novelist and poet Alice Walker, popular mystery writer Walter Mosley, and hundreds of other writers, painters, and musicians owe a debt to the artists of the Harlem Renaissance. For aspiring writers, artists, and musicians, the Harlem Renaissance was proof that art that art excludes no one. Okay, let's turn now and with our page, and we're going to go now to specifically Langston Hughes on 898. Let's begin with dates, 1902 to 1967. And let's begin now with the first heading, Humble Beginnings. Langston Hughes emerged from the Harlem Renaissance, a cultural movement of the 1920s, as one of the country's most successful African American writers and one of the major interpreters to the world of the African American experience. His work was anchored in a childhood that was not always easy. Shortly after his birth in Missouri, Hughes's parents separated, and Hughes was raised primarily by his grandmother. After his grandmother's death, he lived with his mother in half a dozen cities, finally settling in Cleveland, Ohio. Next heading, Writing and Wandering. After graduating from high school in 1921, Hughes published his poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers, in an African American magazine called The Crisis. We'll study this poem in a moment. He moved to New York, where he attended Columbia University and began to explore Harlem, forming a strong attachment to a place he would later help define. After a year, Hughes quit school to work as a steward on a freighter bound for Africa and then traveled in Europe. So here again, as we have said several times before, we have a number of writers in our study of American literature who dropped out of school of some kind or another to go and actually experience life, usually through travel, often through work. Upon his return to the United States, Hughes took a job working in a hotel restaurant in Washington, D.C. One night in 1925, he put 3 of his poems beside the plate of poet Vachel Lindsay. The next day, newspapers trumpeted the news that Lindsay had discovered a new writer. Then in 1926, Hughes' first collection of poetry, The Weary Blues, was published, earning him even more recognition. A scholarship followed, permitting Hughes to continue his education. Top of page 899, Renaissance Man. In 1926, Hughes also wrote an essay titled The Negro Artists and the Racial Mountain. This work, which called for African American artists to, quote, express our individual dark-skinned selves without fear or shame, end quote, helped define the spirit that motivated the Harlem Renaissance. Hughes became a major player in that movement, writing plays, fiction, musical, autobiographies, and screenplays. Over the course of his career, Hughes has experimented with a variety of poetic forms and techniques. He often tried to recreate the rhythms of contemporary blues and jazz, 2 other major artistic expressions of the Harlem experience. However, just as he did not only write poetry, Hughes did not only live in Harlem. He traveled the world and lived much of his life elsewhere. But Harlem was where he felt most welcome, nourished, and inspired. Today, Hughes is recognized as one of the most popular and enduring African American writers of the 20th century. Let's turn to page 900 for just a moment, and let's follow this conversation about the ways in which Hughes is very influenced and influences the blues, as we'll call it. I've often said that Worland High School lacks so many classes that we should enjoy. One of those classes, I think, should be a history of music. And if we were to do a year-long study of nothing but music, sooner or later we would have to get around to American music. And sooner or later we would have to ask the question, the music that you listen to has its antecedent roots where? Where does it come from? How does it trace back? For example, if you listen to any kind of popular music that you would consider to be rap or rock and roll or hard rock, metal, heavy metal, you have to admit that a study of the music that you love actually originates from music that came before it. Much of the music that came before it was not exactly like the music that you listen to today. Many of you would be shocked that much of the music that you love today, especially if you listen to popular music, comes actually out of country music that was actually born of gospel music, and much of that was born as well of the blues, as we call it. As many, many freed slaves, emancipated slaves, moved north, as we've said in earlier lectures, out of the Deep South, they brought with them not just the experiences of the Deep South, and of course the pre-war Civil War slavery, and then the post-Civil War experiences of coming to terms with emancipation and living in the Deep South, but also they brought with them their music and their instruments as well. For example, the banjo came with them from the South, and you began to have this whole new movement of artistic creation through music called the blues. Let's read about it. Langston Hughes made beautiful music with his words, what he and others called jazz poetry. I would definitely write that down. The poet of Harlem riffed with words, much like a musician riffs with musical phrases, intentionally echoing the rhythms of American jazz and blues. Those rhythms could be traced back to the work songs and spirituals sung by slaves toiling in the fields of the South, and to older songs from West Africa. Classic blues songs are set to 12 bars of music in 4/4 time, using 3 simple chords. Hughes used this traditional structure in at least half of his poems. And then there are 4 bullet points here. Let's get them in our notes. First bullet point. Hughes began his career in 1926 with a book of jazz poems, The Weary Blues, written to be performed to musical accompaniment. The second bullet point. In his essay, Songs Called the Blues, 1941, Hughes wrote that the blues were sung by, quote, black, beaten but unbeatable throats, end quote. The third bullet point. In 1958, recording features Hughes reciting his poetry to the accompaniment of the great jazz composer and musician Charles Mingus. And finally, the rhythms of jazz influenced Hughes' 1951 montage of A Dream Deferred, a book-length poem depicting the African-American urban experience. Before we turn to the work of Langston Hughes, we're going to work with several of his poems. The Negro Speaks of Rivers, I Too, Dream Variations, and Refugee in America. Your textbook company, as we pointed out before, as we hit Walt Whitman, as we hit Emily Dickinson, as we hit other really important poets in the American tradition of literature, your textbook company has this really difficult job of deciding which poems are we going to select to somehow represent these really important artists, and these will be the ones that we will look at. But as I've said to you many times before in our conversations, I hope that what happens is that you have some interest that you then can go online and elsewhere, and you can begin to do some reading of some of these really, truly amazing works of art, these poems. Let's turn now to literary analysis. Let's do a quick level 2B read notes, a bit of note-taking on page 901. Literary analysis. The speaker is the voice of a poet, not to always be confused with the poet. Often the speaker is the poet. However, speaker may also be an imaginary person, a group of people, an animal, an inanimate object. In some poems, such as many by Langston Hughes, the speaker is a voice that represents an entire people. I would write that down. So Langston Hughes likes this voice that represents an entire people. As you read these poems, use a chart like the one shown to identify clues that suggest the identity of the speaker, comparing literary works. These poems express multiple themes or more than one essential meaning. While Hughes writes consistently about cultural identity and the status of African Americans within an oppressive society, his focus shifts from themes of suffering, injustice, and struggle to those of pride and beauty. As you read these poems, compare the images, memories, and attitudes Hughes expresses toward African American cultural identity. Look for clues in each poem that reveal the poem's themes. Under reading strategy here, you're going to apply a critical perspective to literature. You're going to read a selection through a particular lens or framing idea. Several are possible. Let's list them in our notes at 2B. You can read these poems from the social or historical perspective, viewing literature as it reflects issues in society at the time when it was written in the 1920s and beyond. Archetypical perspective, right? Viewing literature as an expression of archetypes. We've used this word before. Characters, symbols, or patterns that cross cultures. And finally, biographical perspective, viewing literature as an expression of events and issues in a writer's personal life. as you read these poems, use a chart like the one that's there on page 901 to apply different cultural perspectives and examine how varied lenses reveal different meanings. You also want to pay attention to the 3 vocab words at the bottom of 901. I can guarantee you that those words will end up on the examination. All right, let's now turn to page 902. And the first poem that Langston Hughes published, this one often is anthologized, called The Negro Speaks of Rivers. Here, let's start with our background information on page 902. The Negro Speaks of Rivers was Langston Hughes' first great poem. He wrote it during the summer after he graduated from high school, and it was published a short time later. So let's just pause in your notes and point out that this poem we are about to read, a very famous poem, was written roughly 20 months later from your age, right after you get out of high school and graduate. Yeah, that's when he writes this poem. Hughes considered Carl Sandburg, who we've met already, you'll remember in the poem Chicago and Grass, and Walt Whitman, of course the great poet of Song of Myself, to be the greatest American poets. So let's put this in our notes. Hughes has as his antecedents, that is to say his models that kind of motivate him, Whitman and Carl Sandburg. In The Negro Speaks of Rivers, Hughes follows the model of Whitman's Song of Myself, using a first-person speaker to express the experience of an entire community. I would write this down. Like Whitman, who loves that first-person speaker that represents maybe a large group of people. For example, America is going to be oftentimes what Whitman will say, okay? Or the working class that Whitman will celebrate. Here, we're going to have a single speaker who will be speaking for a whole group of people who, of course, are going to not just be black, not just be of African descent, but many of them are going to have gone through the experience in the Deep South of slavery and in the emancipation that followed the Emancipation Proclamation, or living in the North knowing that their antecedents and their ancestors might have come out of that same kind of background. Most likely did. Let's turn now to the poem and let's read the poem. Notice first of all from level 2B, it's a 10-line offering. We're going to pay attention to the ways in which Hughes will divide the poem into stanzas. Let's read together. I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. All right, let's pause for a moment now and pay attention to the primary symbol, S-Y-M-B-O-L, of this poem. Of course, it's there in the title, the river. Let's pause for a moment and just think about the history of the world as it relates to rivers. The greatest cities in the history of the world all somehow are affiliated with water. Think about that. New York City, London, the River Thames, of course New York City, the Hudson River, Thames of London, of course with Paris, and on and on and on. I mean, all these amazingly important rivers that are part of amazingly important cities. Okay. But what Hughes is going to do is he's going to focus on two things. One, the important history of black people, people of black skin color, whose history comes from other places where there are major rivers and civilizations along with those rivers. And when he mentions these rivers, he's not just mentioning rivers. He is talking about these unbelievably culturally important places in the history of the world. Now we're going to ask the question, put it in your notes. Why are rivers important to the speaker of this poem? Why? And I think we're going to come up with a couple of important answers. Let's take a look. First, he says that he has known rivers. Now, what does the word known here mean? You'll maybe at 3B or 3A jump back to Prufrock's lines. I've known the arms already, known them all. Known the evening, mornings, afternoons. I've measured out my life in coffee saloons. And we think about this, what I have known, what I have known. Here, notice it's repeated several times. I've known rivers. Of course, again, just to pause. That I've can easily be replaced by we have known rivers. Okay? I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. The argument that Hughes will be making is that civilization on this planet comes through the experiences that are around major cities where rivers are there. And of course, these rivers, by and large, are in other places outside of America. Right? The other important symbol here for rivers is, of course, he mentions it, the idea of blood in veins. Right? Your blood flows through your body in veins that are like rivers. And of course, here he's going to join them together, the idea of flowing rivers and flowing blood. He pauses at the end of the first stanza and he says, my soul has grown deep like the rivers. Of course, here, what soul is Langston Hughes speaking of? You could think that he is speaking about the psyche of all people who are black. The experience of what it has to be like to know that your ancestors were forced, by and large, to migrate in the most unholy of experiences in slavery, to come